last thing that I wanted to do, we kind of just game out, is actually kind of like just an educational video, I guess. I don't really know if it would be educational, but it's not like, you know, current events type shit. We're looking at the past.
We're going back to the future. Yeah. A double. Ooh.
Shit looks good. Alright, let's go right into it.
When you hear the
Fucking
phrase
Wendigoon.
nuclear accident, the first thing that comes to your mind is probably
Make sure, I know I'll probably forget at the end. Make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe to Wendigoon.
Chernobyl
Let's get right into
or
it.
Fukushima. And if you were to hear nuclear accidents in the United States, then the first that comes to your mind is probably 3 Mile Island, an incident in Pennsylvania that caused massive
Never heard of it. I've actually never heard of this before.
evacuations and an entire restructuring of the United States energy program, as well as a further distrust of nuclear energy that's continued on to this day. But what if I told you the 3 Mile Island incident is not the largest nuclear accident in United States history? As far as amount of radiation released, it's not even close. And what if I told you the reason you probably haven't heard of the largest nuclear accident is because the powers who were in charge did everything in their power to cover it up? Well, that very thing is what we're going to be talking about. Hello, everybody. Today we are going to be discussing the Church Rock nuclear accident. An accident that occurred on Navajo Nation land in New Mexico, the effects and casualties of which are still being felt to this day. In short, negligence and a lack of accountability on the parts of the government and the corporation holding the nuclear materials led to the suffering of thousands, as well as meager attempts at cleanup that are downright laughable. Depending on what source you get this story from, you'll get a lot of different accounts. Some hold the EPA responsible, some hold United Nuclear Corporation responsible, and some flat out hold the mine workers responsible. Given the variety of perspectives, I think it's important to lay out where a lot of my information is coming from. And all these sources I'll have linked in the description if you want to learn more about this story for yourself, because it's one of those stories that I think is very important to not forget. One of which is the 1987 documentary The River That Harms by Colleen Keene. It's a short watch, 45 minutes, and has several first-person accounts of what happened. Another great visual source is the YouTube channel Navajo Traditional Teachings. Wally Brown, the face of the channel, goes into several videos talking about Navajo history and culture and has a lot of videos related to this topic. The book Yellow Dirt, An American Story of a Poisoned Land and a People Betrayed by Judy Pasternak gives an entire perspective of the history surrounding nuclear events in Navajo Nation. And finally, my buddy Max. Max has been a good friend of mine for years and was born and raised in Navajo Nation. He allowed me to have a first-person perspective of some of the nuclear events involved in this story, and pointed me towards some great resources like the Navajo channel that I mentioned a moment ago. I greatly appreciate him, and will show that appreciation by using the most embarrassing picture of him I could find. Radiation and a lack of care with nuclear energy has led to some of the most horrific accidents in human history. Again, things like Chernobyl or stories I've covered on this channel, like the unimaginably painful death of Hisashi Uchi. But those stories are well known, and I think this one is so terrifying not only because of the effect that it's had, but because of how little it gets talked about. So if you want to hear about it, then stick around after the ad as we talk about the largest nuclear incident in American history. As someone who's currently budgeting...
We're gonna skip the ad though. Sorry, I want to go
to get in on this offer. That's because if you head to the link, just check them, go ahead and get into it, or not always. Thank you for watching. For those that don't know, the Navajo Reservation, or Navajo Nation, is the largest native reservation in the United States. The nation itself lies within the borders of the American states of Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. Navajo Nation itself is over 27,000 square miles, which, to put that in perspective, is right between the sizes of South Carolina and West Virginia. And it boasts a population of nearly 400,000 members. And for the Navajo Nation, conflicts with the U.S. were there from the beginning. See, back in the 1840s, the Navajo fought alongside the United States against the Mexican Army in the Mexican-American War. And like any good ally, after the war was over, the United States tried to kill them for it. Competition for resources led to several skirmishes between Navajo people and American settlers. Eventually, the United States military became involved and adopted a scorched earth policy. This resulted in several attacks against Navajo groups, most of the time resulting in their fields being burned, their homes destroyed, and people killed in order to make them leave. Eventually, the survivors were rounded up and forced to go to a location that the United States had allocated for them. This event was known as the Long Walk, and several people had to travel as far as 300 miles on foot.
Holy shit, dude. 300 miles? What the fuck? I'm not even... Nah, you're bugging out, dude. I'm just... Fuck it.
I'm done. I'm not walking anymore, dude. Like, what the hell? 300 miles, dude?
That's basically like me running... That's like me running a whole year's worth, dude. 3K every day, 365 days.
Not only did this mean several were forced to leave their ancestral homelands in desolation, but sickness and starvation were rampant, and thousands died on the walk there. Eventually, in 1868, a peace treaty was signed between the Navajo and the United States that relegated this reservation as their allotted land. With the caveat, of course, that the United States was still allowed to build stuff or go there when they want. Because of that, a lot of Navajo history from the past couple centuries has been that of tragedy. And I encourage you to look into those for yourself, but for the sake of this video, I want to talk about one incident and the series of hijinks that led to it. So, fast forward a bit to World War II. During World War II, the Navajo had significant contributions to the United States military, especially in the war in the Pacific. For one, Navajo code talkers were invaluable in keeping United States information secret. See, during World War II, there was always the fear of the enemy listening into your communications. So the easiest way to get around this was come up with a code or language that the enemy couldn't understand. So in the Pacific Theater, several Navajo speakers would work as radio operators, using the Navajo language, or Diné, as a way to communicate while under surveillance. Also, sometimes people will use the word Diné just to refer to the language Navajo people speak, but Diné is actually the word that the Navajo use to refer to themselves. So when they say they're speaking Diné, that means they're speaking their own language, kind of like someone from England saying they speak English. And this was a genius move because while, say you used a language like Spanish or Arabic or something to communicate, the Japanese could probably find a way to translate it. I mean, I'm sure they had access to Japanese or Arabic speakers as well. But the United States had a unique resource in that there was a nation that spoke a language within their nation that was not spoken anywhere else in the world. So it was near impossible for the Japanese to translate what the Navajo were saying, and this method of remained uncracked throughout the war. And in the European theater, several Eastern Native American tribes had similar contributions, but against the Japanese, the Navajo were the main players. However, the Navajo Nation would also lead to another huge...
I'm not gonna lie, that name is kind of cool. It sounds like something from Star Wars.
The
development
Navajo.
in the war, the atomic bomb. During the Manhattan Project, the United States needed a lot of uranium. And the most readily available source of uranium were the mountains within Navajo Nation. So while Oppenheimer was assembling the atomic bombs at Los Alamos, just southeast of Navajo Nation, the uranium for those bombs came from the Navajo Nation itself. And then the two bombs were dropped on Japan and the world was changed forever. After World War II, nuclear weapons and nuclear energy were all anyone could think about. So the United States wanted to get a hold of a lot of uranium as fast as they could. Once again, the Navajo Nation was the easiest place to do that. There were other places in the American West that they could have set up.
So they basically just pulled an empire and took all their fucking resources.
It was cheaper. As mentioned, Navajo Nation was formed under dire circumstance. The survivors of attacks from the American military and the Long Walk in the 1860s had to start over from scratch. Because of that, over the decades that followed, as the country around them went through the Industrial Revolution and the Roaring Twenties, the people within Navajo Nation were still destitute. So, as the United States government began to offer them money, they couldn't afford to turn it down. Especially when coupled with the promise that the workers for the mine would be hired Navajo Nation members. So the United States government and corporations began to buy up land and build in Navajo Nation, and build they did. In the 1950s, there were over 750 uranium mines within and around Navajo Nation. Nuclear energy seemed to be the way of the future, and we certainly couldn't fall behind on nuclear weapons with the whole Cold War going on. And for a while, it seemed that the Navajo finally had a consistent source of revenue. And with these new companies coming in, they brought with them industry and infrastructure. For a while, it seemed that finally, the Navajo had a good relation with the United States government, and this time they didn't have to die for it. For a while. Now, it is true that in the 1950s, the world was not as aware of the negative effects of radiation as we are now. But we were certainly aware of some effects. There were published studies connecting uranium mining with high cancer rates as far back as 1929. And at this point, at the very least, we knew that breathing in dust while you're mining underneath the earth is a bad idea, much less if it's radioactive. But if you look at the images of the conditions these Navajo workers were working in, it's hard to find any of them wearing masks or wearing gloves or washing their hands. And it's because the dangers of what they were doing was never properly relayed to them. Because of this, the long-term health effects that have continued throughout Navajo Nation across the entire nation are hard to quantify. You can throw a dart at a map of the nation and probably have some story about a radioactive incident. I asked my friend Max just what his experience with uranium was, and he said the following. Unknown. Likely experience some form of cancer when I get older. The area I grew up and am from has been affected by numerous extraction processes. The coming hydrogen line will be the next. Shiprock, New Mexico, where I am from, housed a uranium and vanadium ore processing facility, with Kerr McGee initially operating the mill from 1954 to 1963, followed by Vanadium Corporation of America until its closure in 1968. My Navajo grandfather might have brought contaminated rocks home for building use. Many families did this as the effects were unknown or not explained fully. The river we use to farm our agriculture and water our animals, as well as ourselves, sits right below a very large disposal site that has been rumored to leak. My experience is picking up the pieces. The extraction process is over, but the health effects remain for generations to come. There's a spike in birth defects and disabilities that coincides with the uranium boom. Prior, it is said we Navajos did not have that problem. Now special care is a common thing in families with young children. It's the water.
Dude,
that's the worst part. And if you're too poor to move, well, like I said earlier, you could spend a career trying to track down all the negative effects that uranium mining had in Navajo.
What's crazy is that in today's day and age, you would think that they would, take time to actually clean this stuff up. But, Navajo
Nation and barely scratched the surface. The book I mentioned, Yellow Dirt, does a great job at compiling several of these, but even then, it's surely not all of them. But to talk about a single incident that encompasses a lot of the things you see throughout these stories, and is certainly the most sensational because, again, the largest nuclear accident in American history, let's talk about Church Rock. In 1977, about 17 miles northeast of Gallup, New Mexico, the Church Rock uranium mill began production. By the 1970s, the uranium business in Navajo Nation and around it was booming. Between 1944 and 1986, it's estimated that as many as 30 million tons of uranium were mined from the area. And in the 1970s, when the desire for nuclear energy was at its peak, the Church Rock mill was opened and was the largest uranium processing mill in the region. The mill itself was technically just off of the nation lands, but it was bordered to the north, west, and south by Navajo Nation. And there were two mines just over in the nation lands, very close to the mill. As mentioned, the mill itself was the largest in the region, processing as many as 4,000 tons of ore daily, which provided the supply for about 5 nuclear power plants every year. However, despite this optimization, the mill had a problem. The same problem that every uranium mill in the country was having at this time: what to do with the tailings. And to explain what tailings are and explain how this accident happened in the first place, I need to tell you a little bit about how uranium mining works. Now, there are 2 ways to mine uranium: in situ mining or open pit mining. In situ mining happens when you find a strain of uranium somewhere underground. You run a pipe down to it, and when you find the deposit, you effectively pump it with a solution that dissolves the mixture. Depending on what kind of rock the uranium's in, this could be water, this could be acid. Whatever it is, you get the material down to a slurry that the pipe can then drink back up, and then you take that solution you've made and refine it from there.
Where monitor well, in the injection well, another monitor well. Damn, there's like 4 monitor wells here.
Whereas open pit mining is the more stereotypical mining that you probably think of when you think of the word mining. Large excavation sites, tunnels, rail cars. In this form, the pieces
these
of uranium are physically
excavations.
chipped off and then the hard materials taken back to be
temptation.
processed. You can see why in situ mining is more favorable nowadays. Not only is it much less invasive and safer, but it's also way more efficient, because previously, if you found
Yeah.
uranium underground, you would have to weigh the cost of mining down to get to it. Whereas now it doesn't really matter how small the vein is. You can just shoot the rod down, get the good stuff up, move somewhere else. Well, in the 1970s, in situ mining wasn't really a thing yet, so open pit mining was the way that these Navajo Nation mines went. So at the Church Rock Mill, these hard rocks would be taken in and they would be ground down to very small pebbles or gravel consistency. And then from there, the uranium elements would be chemically
Ground down
leached,
and to the
or
pound.
in other words, mixed with some acidic solution so that the uranium particles separate from the rock around them. It's effectively the same thing in situ mining now does underneath the earth. You just had to take the rock to a mill and then do the acidic process above ground. The uranium that's extracted from this process would create a material that is commonly known as yellow cake. Called that because, as you can see, the uranium powder looks
Ew.
like cake batter, which nowadays it's not.
Dude, I don't know what fucking expired cake batter you're fucking using, but I've never fucking seen cake batter like that. And I've made cake quite a bit of times before.
Always
That's
yellow.
insanity.
It depends on what acids you
What the
combine it
fuck you're
with.
putting in your
But at
cake?
the time, pretty much all of it was yellow, and to this day, people still just call it yellow cake, even if it's like more brown. From there, the yellow cake is enriched or effectively made more radioactive, and it is then used for nuclear energy. However, this raises the question: what about all the other stuff? Because think about it, uranium is a radioactive material, and if you know anything about radiation, you know that it's probably not great to be around it for a long time. So all of the rocks and materials that were previously connected to the uranium underground, even after you separate the uranium from it, that material is still radioactive. Not to mention all the acids and other chemicals that are now combined to it that you had to use in order to separate the uranium in the first place. This leftover waste from the uranium milling process is known as tailings, or effectively the tail you don't want left over from the thing that you did want. Most of the time, this slurry of tailings would be like a sludge that can contain as much as
Ew.
85% of the original radioactive levels. Again, until the uranium or yellow cake is enriched, it's not super radioactive on its own, or at least not dangerous enough to be around for short periods of time. But these tailings have been around the uranium for however long that uranium was in the ground. So in most cases, the tailings have to be treated just as carefully as the uranium does. Not to mention that when the acid or water solution separates the uranium that the stone was around, that acid leftover, or liquor as it's called, can leave dissolved
Ew, liquor?
thorium-230,
Call it that.
radium-222, or lead-210 in the tailings, all of which, as you can imagine, are very dangerous. So organizations like the EPA and government began to regulate what mines do with these tailings. See, previously they might just be thrown over a ridgeline or kept in these big gravel piles. And then sometimes, say when a mine section was closed off or no longer used, they would use the tailings to refill in those parts of the mine. But as we began to learn how dangerous these tailings were, the rules
What the
around
fuck?
storing them got more strict. So in 1977,
So you're telling me nobody would deduce that all the waste from that would be toxic, and they
when the
what?
Church Rock Mill opened, the government had instituted a new procedure, something called a tailings pond. Water does a really good job at containing radiation levels. This is why typically nuclear reactors will have their fuel rods at the bottom of a deep pool. So the idea of a tailings pond makes sense. If water works there, then just make it do the same thing for the tailings. Dig out a large pit, line the tailings in the bottom of it, and then cover the whole thing in water. Sure, the water becomes really radioactive and, don't touch it, but that prevents the radioactive materials from just
Don't
being in
touch
the
it.
air and affecting people and living things around them. And while yes, this works in theory, as with anything, especially when it comes to nuclear energy, the problem was negligence. And the negligence began with the Church Rock Mill's construction of its
crap.
tailings pond. So the way a tailings pond is supposed to be constructed
Shit.
is whatever pit
I already have a feeling where this is gonna go. Shit.
is dug out is lined with a solid material. This is to, prevent the tailings from sinking underground and potentially contaminating groundwater. Or, burying in the topsoil, which is probably a bad thing. Similarly, any border around the pond, like a dam or a wall, is to be constructed of the same material. Typically, this material would have some of the tailings mixed in as well. So say, for example, you were using concrete as a base. The wall that lines the tailings pond is to be made of solidified tailing. Reason being so that the tailings that you keep in the pond won't have a negative effect on the material over time. Well, that is not how the Church Rock tailings pond was constructed. Rather than building a dam out of certified materials, at Church Rock they were trying a new, conveniently cheaper way of building a dam by just using ground. A 35-foot deep pond was dug out and a 35-foot dam constructed at the end of it. The dam itself being made of, like I said, rocks and sediments. The stated reason for this being that the natural earth from the land will do a fine job at containing the tailings. And while that might have worked, what didn't work was their decision on what to do with the bottom of the pond. If you remember, like I said, these ponds are supposed to be lined to make sure that nothing falls deeper into the earth. Well, after they dug out the 35-foot deep pond, they saw that the bottom of it was composed of silt and clay. And they estimated that this continued underground for about 100 feet. And they decided that's good enough. So they didn't line the pond at all. They just dug a 35-foot hole in the ground, threw a mud dam at the end of it, and called it a day. They figured if the tailings did go down or the irradiated water continued underground, well, it's just like sand or something, so who cares? The reason that the Church Rock incident is such a good perspective of how dumb everyone was being with uranium at the time is because that really gives you a perspective into how haphazard the operation was. They had been playing so fast and loose with the regulations around these things for years that when it got time to build a new mill, it's like, yeah, we've done this before. Just dig it out. Whatever's down there, it'll be fine. There's an idea of doing things this way has worked so far. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as a matter of fact, things went wrong pretty quick. In December of 1977,
everybody
the
just
same year the mill went
instantaneously, you know, like the mummy curse just instantly just started
in
dropping.
operation. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers came out and did an inspection on the tailings pond. They observed already that there were several cracks forming in the surface of the dam. This was especially concerning considering that the tailings pond was just upstream and nearby a tributary of the Puerco River, a massive river that runs south through the Navajo Nation and goes all the way into Arizona. A river that thousands of Navajo people relied on for bathing, drinking water, and their livestock. So the Army told the owners of the Church Rock Mill, a company called United Nuclear Corporation, that they need to fix this. Another inspection occurs in October of 1978, 10 months later, and they observe that not only were there more cracks in the dam, but that the previous cracks had just been sealed over. In other words, there was nothing done structurally to repair the issue in the first place. They effectively just painted over the damage that was starting to occur. Their analysis believed that the reason for the cracks was the fact that once again, this dam was built on 100 feet of silt and clay. Not only a loose material on its own, but a loose material that they have dumped 35 feet of water and radioactive material on top of. So as the ground settled and moved, the unsturdy dam began to crack as it moved with it. They also, on a side note, pointed out that the United Nuclear Corporation had filled the pond 2 feet above its safe level, which, you know, was a debatable safe level in the first place, considering once again, it is a dam of 35 feet of nuclear water on top of 100 feet of sand or silt, clay, whatever. Something you shouldn't build a dam on top of. But, you know, fixing this would cost money, and we don't want to lose that. So they once again just painted over the cracks and waited for something else to happen. Not only should someone have done something after the cracks were found once again in October, but 5 months after that, they had a massive wake-up call. Because on the other side of the country, in Pennsylvania, in March of 1979, the 3 Mile accident took place. A nuclear power plant had a reactor meltdown that led to the evacuation of 140,000 people, as well as the government calling a state of emergency and treating the entire area as a militarized zone. This was a massive deal in the papers. It led to an entire shift in the United States outlook on nuclear energy. It went from the hip and cool way of the future to something that should be feared. Again, this was 7 years before Chernobyl. 3 Mile was one of the first events that made everyone stop and think about nuclear energy. So one would hope At a
Really?
company like the United Nuclear Corporation, who, and again, I cannot stress this enough, they dug a hole in the ground and threw nuclear waste in there. You would think that after they got one inspection,
That's
right when they
crazy,
started,
dude.
and there were cracks, and then they fixed
And I'm saying it's crazy because you would, like I said before, you would think that, you know, being like an agency like this, that this is like their whole job to do this. You would think they'd be more cautious and more, you know, I'd rather be safe than sorry. But nah, it's like fuck it. You know, just like fuck it. Just, you know, seal it up, call it a day. Break time's at 7. Let's go.
that.
Like,
And then 10 months
what?
later, there's more cracks.
It's
And then they
insane.
fix that. And then 5 months later, in March,
Especially considering that the fact that you're on the field too. Like, dude, you could be, you know, exposed to the side effects of this as well. I don't know why you wouldn't be more careful. Like, your own life on the line. Like, what the fuck?
of 79, the largest nuclear incident in the United States at the time, hint, just happened on someone else's watch, and now the whole country is afraid of your industry. You would hope that they would do literally anything. Move the tailing somewhere
Anything,
else, slow
yeah.
production on the mill for a while. But yet again,
Like, at least something.
they did nothing. Any solution would cost money and
Nada.
time that they could use to make more money. What is so frustrating about these events, where
yeah,
stupidity
money. It's all
and
about the
arrogance
money.
shows its head over and over again, is that it's never those people who pay the bill, right? I mean, that's what the entire uranium industry in the Navajo Nation had done up until this point. Cancer was beginning to pop up sporadically. Children were being born with birth defects. But as long as they could keep making money,
Yeah.
and no one told them they had to quit, well, that meant they could keep making money. Despite the Army issuing reports that the dam would eventually fail, no one stepped in. There were no additional regulations, no fines. They were just allowed to keep doing business as usual. And inevitably,
Crazy, dude.
as it always does with these things,
No
someone got hurt.
consequences.
Because on July 16th, 1979, a little less than 4 months
There
after
we
the
go.
3 Mile accident, another accident took place. At around 5:30 a.m.,
Catastrophe.
another previously unidentified crack grew into a 20-foot hole. Seems the pressure of the water against the failing dam was too great, and the water simply blew a hole in the dam. This caused thousands
Holy
of gallons
crap.
of water to begin flying out of the tailings pond. Witnesses in the early morning hours said that they heard what sounded like a waterfall or geyser, and it was then about 30 minutes later at 6 a.m. that the hole was noticed.
Holy crap.
Immediately, United Nuclear Crew's emergency teams respond and worked as fast as they could to seal up the dam. But the water flow could not be stopped until 2 hours later at 8 a.m. Meanwhile, the liquid flew into the Arroyo, an artificial tributary of the Puerco River. Ironically enough, a tributary that was made to supply water to a nearby uranium mine. The water flew down the Arroyo and made it into the Puerco River that once again thousands of people relied on. And it got there just as many
Oh,
people who lived along the
no.
banks of the river got up to start their day. There was an emergency dam just beneath the main dam that prevented a lot of the solid material from making its way into the water. But despite that, it's estimated that 1,100 short tons of solid tailings waste and 94 million gallons of liquid waste made their way into the Puerco. Again, liquid that contains
Oh,
things like radioactive
shit.
lead and
That guy, whoever's the building instructor, you already know he
Definitely got fucking fired. He definitely got fired, dude. Either that or he's in jail or something like that.
radium. And even if the people didn't know what was
And if it's
happening
neither,
yet,
I'm gonna be actually
effects
upset.
were immediate. Just downstream of the mill was a small community called Redwater Pond. Within Redwater Pond, several reports began to surface over the following days of animals drinking the water and falling over dead. There's at least one confirmed report of a little boy wading through the water and then going to the doctor because his feet began to burn. Similarly, several people from the community attest that if they touched the river, whatever they touched it with began to sting. There's also several reports in the months and years that followed of people requiring amputations. Remember the yellow cake I
Oh.
mentioned earlier, what uranium looks like in its raw form? Well, considering that all of these materials had come into contact with uranium, several people noted that the banks of the river seemed to have a thin yellow film, the water itself quite literally foaming with nuclear material. The radiation surge
Oh.
was detected as far away as Sanders, Arizona, 50 miles downstream, and it's estimated that the
Oh,
actual effects
fuck.
ended in Chambers, Arizona, 60 miles away from Church Rock and 80 miles downstream. On the
God.
day of the incident, Navajo people in the
Dude.
community became suspicious of the
You
river.
done
And
fucked
people who
up,
relied on the water
Aaron.
began to seek water from other wells nearby. But within days, as mentioned, their animals began to die and their crops began to die as well. Initially, it seems United Nuclear Corporation kind of panicked. They reported the breach, but between organizations like the EPA and the Environmental Improvement Division, no one really knew what to do. So because of that, for a couple days, they didn't do anything. They knew people were
What the-
contaminated and getting sick, and sure, some of the people in the community noticed when their hands started to burn, but no official announcement came until dozens of hours after the fact. And sure, if you're right there at the base of Church Rock,
What?
maybe you
What the fuck, dude?
That's crazy. You thought doing nothing was better than
At least trying to do something? That's insane. Fuck it, dude.
like what?
came in
Oh,
contact
man.
with the river and realized it was bad for you. But people 2-3 miles
Like, I want to say I'd rather you do something than nothing. But then now thinking about it, like, I don't know. I'd rather you not cause me more pain if you're going to do something stupid that you're not sure if it's going to work and it ends up, you know, backfiring. And now I'm like,
You know,
miles further downriver,
suffering
where the
3
effects weren't
times.
as immediate, went on as if
times more.
everything was fine. United
Hell
Nuclear
no.
Corporation simply waited to be told what to do instead of, taking any responsibility
What?
for the lives they've now ruined.
Oh my God.
After a couple days, the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Indian Health Service began to warn Navajo people about the dangers of drinking the water. This was mostly done by going door to door and letting people know to stay away from the river, but again, that's not exactly all encompassing. And even if you did get that message, it's like, okay, well, I guess I'm not drinking
They should
water
just
until
starve.
someone gives me some. Another day or two later, the Environmental Improvement
Yeah,
Division
what?
of New Mexico showed
Like
up
they're just
and
supposed
began
to
to
die?
issue warnings. They did this by using radio broadcast and signs placed near the river telling people to stay away from the water. However, in their infinite wisdom, both the
Been
signs and
discontinued.
radio messages were in English. And English was
Oh
not
my
commonly
God.
spoken, especially around the area downstream from the Church Rock Mill within
What
Navajo
a bunch of
Nation.
baboons.
As mentioned, Dene is the primary Navajo language, and a lot of people were not bilingual at this time. I asked Max about this to clarify again as someone who lives in the region, and he said, "It was not until my mother's generation that many Navajos became bilingual. Prior to that, the elders of the previous generation were mixed, some traumatized to speak the language from boarding schools. Boarding schools and off-reservation Indian
traumatized.
dormitory schools in Oklahoma and California were common for Navajos to be sent to as children. I believe it is written into our 1868 peace treaty, which is what we've operated under as a tribe since. My generation, language is almost decimated. That's how short of a time it took due to the increase in technology, in my opinion." Max is my age, by the way, so his mother would have been a child at the time this incident took place. After criticism about
Really?
this, they took down the signs that were in just English and added a version that incorporated Dene. But again, at this point, you're nearly a week removed from the accident. The effects are already being
it's too
felt,
late,
and
yeah. At
still,
this point, you're
people
freaking
don't have
cooked.
water. In some
Like, at this point, dude, you're like guaranteed cancer.
summarizing
Like,
these
what?
early stages in Yellow Dirt, Judy
The
Pasternak
fuck?
says the following. Some 93 million gallons of radioactive liquid poured from the pond into the arroyo, and from the arroyo into the riverbed. The water, filled with acids from the milling process, twisted a metal culvert in the Puerco and burned the feet of a little boy who went wading. Sheep keeled over and died, and crops curdled along the banks. The surge of radiation was detected as far away as Sanders, Arizona, 50 miles downstream. The Indian Health Service and the state urged Navajos not to drink the water nor enter it, nor let their animals do so, anywhere downstream from the spill. But the people by the Puerco
Yeah, but then what the
didn't
hell
have
are we
many
supposed to eat,
alternatives.
though?
United Nuclear
Yeah,
distributed
well, it's easy to tell somebody not to
600-gallon
do
bottles
something,
of
but give
clean
them an
water,
but not
but
give
the
them an
Church Rock
alternative,
chapter
or what?
calculated that more than 30,000 gallons a day were needed. The 3 community wells serving Church Rock, regulated by the Indian Health Service, were useless. One at the Church Rock School had already been closed, having been flagged just the previous month for high levels of radium and alpha particles. The 2 others contained water with high iron and bacteria levels. Then there were 5 shallow wells along the river owned and maintained by the tribe, marked by metal windmills that turned to bring the water up. These were in various states of disrepair and perhaps at risk. Indian Health Service asked the tribe to fix them and advised residents that these, quote, are not expected to show any contamination, if at all, for several years. When it was all over, after the company was pressured to increase its water deliveries and build some livestock watering tanks, Harold So visited the Puerco and noticed many white crystals with a yellowish tinge along the bottom of the drying wash. These salts
Yeah,
were
the
new
radiation
and had never
city.
shown up after
Like
past
Fallout
flooding.
over there.
Eventually, the United Nuclear Corporation
Fallout
sent
through
their
the
own
fallout,
workers, again
baby,
Navajo people that
when
can
they
actually speak
drop
the
that
language,
bomb.
door to door to make sure everyone knew to stay away
Crawl
from the river.
out through
Again, a
the
task that was
fallout,
easier said than
baby.
done. Navajo Nation
When they
members
drop
urged
that
the at the
bomb.
time governor of New Mexico, Bruce King, to declare a state of emergency. Similar to what happened at 3 Mile Island, it allows the government to be much more hands-on and immediately clean up and provide aid for the region. But Bruce King never did. And incredibly frustrating, for years, nothing happened. Despite this affecting the homes and safe drinking water of an estimated
happened.
1,700 people, they just let it be. Go get your water somewhere else, and if you can't and your animals are dead and there's nothing you can do, sorry. But not even that, not even a sorry. Just let it continue. There were a series of
Just like, yeah,
investigations that
whoops,
followed,
with the
sure, but
SpaghettiOs.
their conclusions were laughable. In the Redwater Pond region, people were dissecting animals that had killed over after drinking the water, and upon opening them up, several of their organs were visibly yellowed. A study was conducted on the cattle and a
Oh,
conclusion
man.
given that it should be fine if cattle is not dependent on for food. To look at people whose entire life is like agriculture and farming and they raise the animals they eat and be like, well, I mean, that's fine as long as you don't need these things. At the beginning of the Puerco where the tailings dam broke into, early estimates show that
Oh
the
my
radiation
God,
levels in the
dude.
water was 7,000 times the allowable limit. And regardless of all of this, Navajo people were just
You know what's crazy? Like, we're laughing at how, this shit was back in the past, of how ignorant we were in the past, but some countries are still like this today, dude,
told,
which is crazy.
get your water somewhere else, figure it out. Oh, what's that? All the wells in the community are bad because of the 20 years of mining we've done right here. I guess
Oh, well.
figure it out. Not to mention that through
bad,
all
so
of this,
sad.
United Nuclear Corporation was doing everything they could to point blame somewhere else. As a matter of fact, they outright denied the claim that any livestock died from drinking from their, again, 7,000 times the safe limit, irradiated river. The vice president of the
Oh,
Navajo
nah.
Tribal Council at
That's
the
some
time,
dickhead
Frank
shit.
Paul, is quoted in the investigation as saying, somehow, United Nuclear Corporation was permitted to locate a tailings pond and a dam on an unstable geological formation. Somehow, United Nuclear Corporation was allowed to design an unsafe tailings dam not in conformance to its own design criteria. Somehow, United Nuclear Corporation was permitted to inadequately deal with warning cracks that had appeared over 2 years prior to the date the dam failed. Somehow, United Nuclear Corporation was permitted to continue a temporary dam for 6 months beyond its design life. Somehow, United Nuclear Corporation was permitted to have a tailings dam without either an adequate contingency plan or sufficient men and material in place to deal with the spill. Somehow, United Nuclear Corporation was permitted to deal with the spill by doing almost nothing. And then you want to know the craziest part? I mean, there's so many, but one of them, initially the people affected asked for $25,000 each in compensation, which for possible lifelong damage and generational damage and losing access to safe drinking water, $25,000 is like child's money, but okay. United Nuclear
Like,
Corporation not only denied the $25,000, but denied that they needed to pay out any large sum of money because the employees that were working there and were affected by this spill never requested workers' compensation. And the actual
What
amount
the
that they ended up paying out was about $2,000.
Each of the families initially sought $25,000 in damages, but
That's some
they eventually
dickhead
settled
shit,
for
yeah.
about $2,000 each. In
Oh,
fact,
nah.
the Navajo people signed a release that forfeits their right to sue UNC in the future. This agreement may apply even if they experience an increase in cancers and birth defects.
With a total fine, effectively, an out-of-court settlement with the Navajo Nation of $525,000. But not only that, this all happened in July, right? Well, a couple months later, they began repairing the dam that caused all this in the first place. And once the dam was remade, on November 2nd of the same year, the mill opened back up again. And yes, continue to use the exact same tailings pond. It's like fake,
Oh
right?
my god.
Like if
dude.
someone wrote this level of like evil and negligence from the government and the company into a story, I would call it hokey, too unbelievable. But these people exist and they got away with it. What's so heartbreaking about it is it's not even just them. Like, it's
That's
not
actually
even
pretty
just
fucked
being
up,
like, oh, I
dude.
can't believe there's this one corporation that was that evil. The reason they got away with all of this and the reason that it got shoved under the rug as much as it did is because it was happening everywhere. Like, if another dam somewhere on Navajo Nation had the same problem, same thing would have happened. They've been playing it fast and loose for 30 years at this point, the entire uranium industry. So
Said
why would this
fast
be a
and
problem?
loose.
It's so frustrating because it's like with other incidents, like 3 Mile Island or Fukushima or something. Something goes wrong and everyone acknowledges that it goes wrong. But here they know they can get away with it. So it happens and they're just like, so? And the disgusting level of demeaning people affected by this. Several of the people who went to the hospital because they were complaining of burns were written off as heat stroke. Evil people got away with being evil because there was a lot of
What?
evil people to hide behind. Eventually, considering United Nuclear Corporation was, again, continuing the mine, they were pressured to clean up the area, so they assigned a bunch of workers to take shovels and 55-gallon drums and just scrape up some of the riverbank, you know, because that'll fix it. All in all, too little, 2 years too late, they managed to gather about 3,500 barrels of waste off the shores of the Puerco River, which is estimated to be about 1% of the affected area. So, great job, team. One bright influence in the midst of this was
You've done
a
nothing,
United
you
States
are
politician
nothing,
named
you'll
Stuart
never be
Udall.
nothing.
Udall was the Secretary of the Interior under President Kennedy. And when he found out about all this, he wanted to do something about it. So in 1983, he decided to try to get this case taken to the Supreme Court. His son was a lawyer that helped with the case. His wife got a Navajo artist to contribute $25,000 from one of his art pieces in order to raise enough money for the people affected by this incident to be able to show up at trial. It seemed that he really had a heart for what he was doing. He wanted these people to get some justice. And in 1983, there was a 3-week trial where they tried to fight to get it taken to the Supreme Court, but it never made it there. Seems ultimately the judge came down to the conclusion that it was a tangled mess and it's not really sure who's to blame. I would argue everyone, but the United Nuclear Corporation was supposed to be in checks by the government who weren't doing anything. And the federal government claimed that the Navajo government was supposed to be looking over a bunch of this stuff, and the Navajo government said that their hands were tied. Everyone was pointing at each other, and it seemed that in order to put someone on trial, you had to put everyone on trial, and that was too much, I guess. However, on another bright side, considering the EPA was starting to barrel down on, treating people in Navajo Nation like inconvenient guinea pigs, and in 1982, amidst the controversy, the Church Rock Mill had shut down. But it was just one of many mills across Navajo Nation. Again, the Church Rock incident is so big because it was...
To be fair, they are kind of right, though. I mean, you kind of sold your own people out for money. You know? So it's like, what do you expect? You can't just be expecting to sell out your people for money and then expect nothing bad to happen, you know? That's not how this works. Like, I don't know. Like, I'm not blaming them, obviously. But what I am saying is that it's not like they didn't know that shit was going down, you know?
one moment where the dam quite literally burst. But like when Udall tried to take this case to court, he wasn't just talking about Church Rock. He was bringing forward miners who had cancer and widows who had lost husbands and sons. What was happening was bigger than just the United Nuclear Corporation. It was bigger than just Church Rock. But thankfully, it seems that because of people like Udall trying to get these cases brought forward, and things like Church Rock, as tragic as they were, made people wake up. In Udall's hearings, it was brought up, quote from
dude.
Yellow Dirt, that the Navajo uranium miners averaged cumulative exposures that were about 44 times higher than the levels of those at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Two bombs that, again, the very...
Like, they probably should have looked more into it, too, is what I'm trying to say. Like, the Navajo shouldn't have just taken the money and that's it. They should have asked more questions to see what they were doing. And, you know, if they didn't like it, they should have protested something, like, while it was happening. Like, during the actual thing of the mine, not, like, you know, after.
uranium that was used was taken from the Navajo lands. Throughout the rest of the 80s, mostly because of, again, events like Chernobyl and a growing disdain towards nuclear energy, mills and mines throughout Navajo Nation began to shut down. While some of them safely removed their dangerous materials and closed up in a good way, others simply dropped their pickaxes and left everything there. To this day, there are over 500 abandoned mines across and around Navajo Nation, several of which still containing very dangerous material. And as for the effect that things like Church Rock and the other uranium mines had, I mean, it's plain to see. Once again, quoting from Yellow Dirt, by the mid-1980s, a group of pathologists from Utah and Colorado had examined the tissues and bones of uranium miners and millers to follow the alpha-emitting variations of uranium and thorium. They found concentrations not just in the lung, but also in the liver, kidney, spleen, gonad, and heart. They also found
Just
the isotopes in
basically.
ribs and vertebrae and sternum. The accumulations vary dramatically from tissue to tissue, from bone to bone, and among the dead men. Perhaps these distributions accounted for the disturbing findings in a review of 259 dead miners. As expected, lung cancer rates were 56 times as high as the general populations, and stomach cancer too fit the pattern that Auld had discovered, at 82 times the rate for males 55 to 79 years of age. But there was more. The mortality rates among these miners for cancers of the prostate were 45 times higher, of the pancreas 78 times higher, of the liver 263 times higher, and of the bladder 68 times higher. In addition to these, the New Mexico Tumor Registry expressed concern over possible associations of mining with pituitary and kidney cancers. Non-cancers, but nonetheless serious health impacts, were also a concern. The PHS linked high radon levels in the mines to an increased risk of lung diseases, tuberculosis, fibrosis, silicosis. Uranium was known too to damage kidneys because of its chemistry as a heavy metal rather than its radiation. The March of Dimes funded a study of birth defects in the Shiprock area and found that the increase had a statistically significant association with the mother living near a uranium mine or mill. But the author urged caution because of the small numbers involved and the need for more study. It's one of those things that officially on paper no one died in the Church Rock incident, but we know that's not true. And again, it's hard to even separate just the Church Rock incident from all the other incidents that occurred at the same time. United Nuclear Corporation was bought out by General Electric, and similar to all the other companies, no one paid for what they did. Well, they paid $525,000, so. I asked my buddy Max for his thoughts on all of this, and here's some of what he said. I've been to the Church Rock spill once, and they've been at it as a community to address lingering effects and issues. Knowing contamination breaches historically, Navajo Nation government and other entities continue to pursue extraction, exploiting, contaminating, etc. for money. Families in impacted community areas are having health issues. They've been advocating to remove what's left of apparently low-grade uranium remnant ore from their area. I think recently it was approved finally for removal, but others were concerned about removing, hauling away to other areas, even another tribal community area near Blanding, Utah. As he mentioned, in years previous, organizations like the EPA have began to implement plans in order to start getting the uranium or radioactive materials out of there. That tailing pond is still there. It's still just sitting there, and until something official is done to get those materials out, who knows? Could break again. There's other places where there's just flat out giant mounds
If it has
of
already, it probably
dumped
will.
waste. Not even an attempt to throw water over it for whatever that did. And if it wasn't frustrating enough, when I was reading about this story, I was reading about this year in 2025 as organizations are trying to remove radioactive waste from the area so that, people quit dying and quit getting cancer and quit having birth defects so people can stop being afraid to have children. Navajo Nation members were protesting new legislation that allowed other uranium companies to move uranium product through the area. That's right. Now that nuclear energy is back on the market, well, we don't want to drive around Navajo Nation, so they won't care if we cut through it. These people may have serious fears and generational problems because of this stuff. It won't hurt them to look at a few trucks drive by with it every now and then. For areas like Redwater Pond, most of the people got up and left. Several of them moved to Gallup, New Mexico, off of reservation lands. For others who have...
And I bet you none of them were fucking, repaid or given a new home either.
lived there the whole life, Maybe a group of people who got to that area in the first place because they were forced to go on a long walk don't want to go on a long walk again. In Max's closing thoughts, he said to me, "Some might consider it downright intentional. Some tribe members believe the war rages on and the tactics have changed. Violence has been one."
Like, now I see why people like living on the mountains, you know? It's just isolated. Nobody messes with you up there. Nobody can really do anything up there because, you know, it's terrible terrain.
One-sided for so long, it makes you wonder about the spiritual warfare side of things, of which fellow Navajos do believe that's exactly what's going on. I think John Trudell quotes it best. Quote, "I've heard a lot of people talk about the theoretical nuclear war. What if it ever comes? Well, the nuclear war is here.
Yeah.
That's what the dead Navajo uranium miner is. He's a victim of that war. That's what the stillbirths and miscarriages are on Pine Ridge, where the radioactivity has reached into the water." And nowadays, it is more encouraging because there are organizations, there are people that are trying to make things better. It makes me infinitely furious that the people who were actually responsible got away with it. And now any funding that can actually get the materials they left behind out of the region will have to come out of public funds or taxpayers' money. But that stuff needs out of there, regardless of the
that's
cost.
fucked up.
So many of these corporations, like the United Nuclear Corporation or the government in general, was hopeful that we'd all just forget about it. That all the people there would shut up and walk away or die off. And I'm glad that there are some people who haven't forgotten about it. I'm glad that there's some people who, despite how long ago it was, are willing to say, yeah, let's do something now. It may be too little too late, but let's do what little we can. Max also wished to share Matthew 7:23. It's in a sermon where Jesus is talking about what God will say on Judgment Day, and the verse says, quote, "And then will I profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity." He knows how to get me going. And ultimately, yes, history is tragic. I'm glad that now there are plans underway. I hope that it'll take years, but within years, whatever it is, we can do
history is
something
wild, man.
to hopefully make the next several generations not suffer the mistakes of our past ones. When the dam initially broke, United Nuclear Corporation estimated that about 1 curie of nuclear radiation was released, when in reality, it was about 46. To put that in perspective, 3 Mile Island all in all released about 13. The largest nuclear incident in American
Holy
history
shit.
and the third largest of all time, again behind Chernobyl and Fukushima, seems nearly forgotten. But if there's one upside out of this entire video, you haven't forgotten it. At least not now. And in whatever way you can, sure, the past is
Yeah, it's pretty
awful,
crazy.
and yes,
Not even know
atrocious
that
things
thing
were done.
existed.
But I am merely the storyteller. I just knew about this whole thing and had to tell someone. So I'm
He's
glad
just the
you're here to
messenger boy.
listen. And above all else, I just want to say
The
thank you
messenger
for
boy.
watching. Thank you all so much for
The messenger man, rather. He's a man.
Alright. Well, hopefully that was a nice little educational piece for you. Hope you guys enjoy this shit. It's pretty crazy. I didn't expect it to be that bad, but that was insane. And I thought, you know, we would have done a better job at cleaning it up, but I guess not. Anyways, I hope you guys liked the video. Make sure to go like and subscribe to Wendigoon, like I said earlier. And I will also catch you guys in the next one. And make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe on my YouTube channel. And check out the Kick and the Twitch. Alright.